The fight against racism in our tertiary institutions.
Yes, because it's a very important question, because Stellenbosch University Senior Director of Student Affairs, Dr. Choice Mageta, said the institution strongly condemns any destructive behavior that is at least instituted or imposed on students. And she also added that the university would probe into this particular incident. And the resident management also strongly condemned the incident, and they've also taken steps to make sure that they take care of the residents that actually stay in that particular hostel.
Well, Jack, you see expressions, we went straight to Stellenbosch University to get to the bottom of this incident, and we have our producer Mzianda Mbedla who's put this report together for us. Take a look.
Why are you being in my room? Huh? Why are you being in my room, bro? Why are you being for someone?
So right now with me obviously is Babalo, and I'm in the dormitory in his room where this incident actually took place, and obviously he's going to be having a chat with me about what actually happened to him and obviously how he's feeling. How are you holding up?
But step by step, I'm getting there.
Where exactly did he do this disgusting thing that he did to you?
Yenzele apha kule tafile.
What was the thought that went through your mind?
Bensalele so ndithukene late isibane so bikhona ukuthuka, and then once ndifune uba violent but ke.
What is it that you'd like to see happen?
I would like to see him getting expelled, and also I would like to see him suffering the consequences of his actions. Maybe going to jail. Tiza for a week, then after that, I just need to go home and process everything in the environment that I'm used to.
Is he going to be expelled?
We cannot preempt the outcome of the disciplinary, but what happened is actually very serious. I cannot see any other outcome from this.
Stellenbosch University has elements of racism. Yeah. Hence, such cases are happening, and we know that there are many cases that are happening but not reported to, because of some sense of fear from many black students or students of color.
What is the way forward?
There needs to be a conversation about, the suggestions that we put through and the work that we put in, and that actually being visible. An institution that shows us that it listens to its students and it hears the cries of its students.
And of course, that was Expressions on the ground, giving you a blow-by-blow account of what is actually happening there in Stellenbosch University. But I'm not having this discussion by myself. I'm joined, at least in our makeshift studio here at the M1 studio, by Jamie Mighty, who is a political analyst, as well as Unhlonipo Nxumalo from South NEC, who obviously are going to be helping me unpack this very important conversation around racism within that particular institution. Of course, Mkolisi is going to be speaking to our audience that we have today. Oh, hello.
Well, thanks, Jackie, for that. And of course, we've got the various student formations that are also joining us. It's great to have you guys. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we're going to have meaningful conversations. Jacqueline, let's get the conversation started.
Indeed, let's get this conversation going. And Hlonipo, we as Expressions were obviously on the ground, and then obviously you are representing students holistically across the country. It was kind of surprising that you guys were not there on the ground. I just want to find out why you were not there, and what is also the motivation behind why you would put your weight behind certain causes.
Firstly, I would like to clarify that it's not that we're not on the ground. We were on the ground, we wrote statements, and we were in solidarity with the students of Stellenbosch. Also, we were very angry and disappointed that at this point in time, we still have such cases happening in our institutions of higher learning. However, we're not surprised, because when we look at the composition of the staff members in Stellenbosch, it is Afrikaner dominant. So we're not surprised of what transpired there. However, we are indeed in solidarity with the students of Stellenbosch, and we have been engaging with the management of Stellenbosch as it regards to that they must form a body that will interrogate all racial matters and address them.
Jamie, this is a conversation we have year in, year out, month in, month out. Are we ever going to get to a point as a country where we're able to win the battle against racism, especially in tertiary institutions such as Stellenbosch?
I think that it is a conversation that continues to happen every year, because the transformation process in the universities has just been superficial and performative, but not meaningful. I think that we've all experienced problems with universities, WITS, UJ, Stellenbosch, UCT, but oftentimes the cultural problems that are identified by students are ignored by the administration because they don't experience them, especially when you consider the problematic residences which have allegiance to apartheid leaders, to apartheid icons, to thinkers who structured the racist ideology and propaganda of the Broederbond and the National Party. So unless we actually begin to discuss, why did the students say, this is what we do to black people? We, who is the we? What is happening in this residence that continues to inculcate hatred of the other, rejection and ejection of the other? I think that unless we do have real conversation and real remedial action in those spaces, because we can't move on next week at the University of Stellenbosch like this didn't happen. We can't move on at most of the schools where the discrimination has been manifesting like it hasn't happened. We can't keep on doing what we do, where we have a moment of a flashpoint. Everyone congregates, says, why did this happen? Why is this girl being asked to cut her hair? Why is this boy worrying now about people peeing on his bed? And then next week we move on. Like, just because the news has moved on doesn't mean that the structural issue has been resolved.
Yeah. And I want to ask you this, Nonhlonipo. You know, Stellenbosch University does not have a racism policy, so they don't actually even have any kind of directive around, if an incident like this were to arise, this is how we should deal with it. So I want to find out from you, what is the appropriate sentence for an institution that already does not necessarily even have any kind of frame of reference around how they deal with a situation like this? How do you deal with somebody like the Institute, who's obviously violated the human rights of another student?
Firstly, I'd like to think that institutions, all of them, the Department of Higher Education should have a policy that regulates all the institutions. Should someone be found guilty of doing something, this is what must happen. Because this thing of institutional autonomy it's what making the institution to do as they please. Because you'll find that the University of Stellenbosch is saying we have suspended this student. It's just performative because the media is looking at it, and not because they really want to address the issue. So as you're saying, a policy needs to be formed, and the policy needs to be binding to all institutions of higher learning, because we can't go, if this thing now happens at VETS, now we must go to VETS and say we want a policy at VETS. If it happens to UCT, we must go to UCT again and say we want this policy. And also, I think this must also go to all other acts such as rape, because we do have rape. In fact, in Stellenbosch, a few days after this incident, there was a rape case. We do not really have policies that speak to rape. Should someone be found guilty of rape, what must happen to them? However, we do have financial exclusion, we do have academic exclusion, things that we do not have control over. However, when someone decides to wake up and go rape someone, go and do racist acts to someone, that person there's no really a policy that excludes them from from being one of us.
And look, and I think we're gonna obviously extend this conversation a little bit further after the break, because also a very interesting development as well from University of Stellenbosch is that a student by the name of Anka Pierce has actually at least instigated some kind of just getting students to be involved in making sure that this particular student gets expelled in that university. A petition that she's put together to make sure that this particular student gets expelled from this particular university. But we continue with this very important conversation. We're asking you, are we ever going to get to a point where we are winning the battle against racism, especially in tertiary institutions, particularly in Stellenbosch University? You're watching Expressions. We'll be back right after this.
Shows that students need to unite together, they need to stand together. Social cohesion is much more important if we want to dismantle racism.
Tina, as abantwana bamnyama, we're doing everything we can in our powers to change the situation. But abaphathi bethu aba bamhlophe bona basijonge ngathi mhlawumbi thina sedlala upuca.
There are structural changes that need to be made because the racism is embedded in the structures of the tertiary institutions.
I really don't think we are winning. I haven't seen any change. Things are still going on the same way, so I don't think so.
I don't think that we can say that we're running any battle of racism when institutions like Stellenbosch can excuse neo-Nazi posters. They can excuse people urinating on black students' things. They can excuse the fact that black students are left out of engagements such as your socials, your sparkles. And when it comes to it, we are being treated like it seems like we're fighting a losing battle.
As student leaders, we are mobilizing, and I want to call specifically on my fellow white students to pitch to these protests, to come together. The fact of the matter is we're still the majority at this institution, and that is not right.
Into endihlelo uyibona mna isikakhulu is that phaa kwii-res zethu i-placement policy funeka kubekho abantu abamhlophe, I mean abantu abamnyama more, because umzekelo i-percentage abantu abamhlophe is 70%, i-30% international students nabantwana abamnyama.
I think students need to understand their power because they are the clients of the university.
I would like the perpetrator to be expelled.
I want to see real change. I want to see people making a real effort and not just talking about.
All right, imibono ke yolusha loyo khona le Stellenbosch lapho i-expressions ibikhona phela ukuthi sizwe ukuthi ngabe bona bathini kakhulukazi emva kwalesi sehlakalo esivelile khona le Stellenbosch. Siphinde sinibekele sinamukele, you still with us khona la ku-expressions khona la ku-SABC 1. We are talking about racism ohlelweni namhlanje. Siyabuza ukuthi are we going to win the fight against racism ikakhulukazi in our tertiary institutions? Guys, I have to welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for your time. Ngizoqala nge-EFF student command. Guys, sizwile kuma panelists ethu just at the top of the program bakhuluma ngokuthi i-transformation kuma higher learning institutions is superficial rather ayenzeki ngendlela ekufanele yenzeke ngayo. What is your guys' take as having been on the ground as a student command? What's your take on this, sir? Yes, sir.
No, thank you very much. This is Kutom Nisi from UJ, former SRC chairperson. I don't think that the incidents of racism or anyone in South Africa will ever conquer racism without addressing the national question of colonialism. The reason why you have white students behaving the way that they are behaving is because that stems from the fact that they are owning the means of production in South Africa. They know that even the institutions of higher learning that they are currently studying at are owned by the very same white people that we are busy fighting against in institutions of higher learning. We can never win the fight of racism unless we address the structural problem of racism in a country as a whole. We always make this argument that you cannot have a decolonized education system in South Africa unless you have a decolonized society in South Africa. So we cannot win this fight. So, for example, you have white people are owning almost everything in South Africa, including the education system itself. You had Johan Rupert, who I doubt that he even has a metric, but he was the chancellor of Stellenbosch, presiding over an institution that thrives itself because of its knowledge or knowledge production. So that shows you that you can no longer fight racism at an institutional level. It must be fought in society as a whole.
All right, let's bring in Daso as well on the side. I know you were a former president of the SRC. Speak to us about, how we heard from the other side that there are no specific policies in dealing with racism. Did you guys champion any cause, perhaps to ensure that we have better dialogues and we curb racism in our higher learning institutions?
100%. When I was SRC president at the University of Pretoria in 2018, Adasso-led SRC, we tackled the structural racism that existed in residences. We went about completely eradicating the names at the institution, the names of residences, so that there was a complete change of that. And then we also made sure that we banned the traditions amongst first-year students and amongst just the broader student society, so that we could create an inclusive institution. The reality is that we can't change society unless we change the systems, and so we went about a complete overhaul of that. And a big issue is, we had in the University of Pretoria Council, conversations where the Vice Chancellor would say that this institution is transformed, and I would go to those council and I'd say, look, there are still corridors and residences that have the name Orania, and you can't say that an institution is transformed. You can't say that an institution is inclusive with such a space created, and we have to tackle the structural inequalities.
Okay, I need to also bring in Isasco into the conversation, guys. I don't know. I think some of the problems that we're dealing with right now are so big that we're still having a conversation on racism in 2022, so many years into democracy. What conversations should we be having, Bafetu, as young people, as you guys, the leaders, Guma tertiary institutions zetu? What conversations should we be having to eradicate racism?
Thank you. My name is Patucha Zontura, and I'm the provincial convener of SASCO. And yet again, quite disappointed by the former president of UP, who concedes quite clearly to what Jamie said earlier on, that we deal with superficial change and nothing fundamental. Changing a race name and eradicating race culture doesn't necessarily fundamentally deal with the problem of racism. But what we need to do is diagnose where this racism is happening. It's happening at Stellenbosch, UCT, UP, the very same UP that still has a quota of white kids that must form part and parcel of a race. I think it's 60% in one of the historic Afrikaner races. And you allow things like that to happen. So the conversation isn't necessarily centered around what we need to do, like the previous speaker considered to. These are the hubs and centers of the means of production. There's a perverse relationship between money, poverty, and racism. The more poor we are, and the more we are on NEFSAs and on bursaries and we're dependent on these systems that these people put in place, is the more that their kids feel the need to treat us like second-class citizens in these institutions. So what we need to fundamentally do is to have some form of recourse, because I don't think we are still at a point where we need to have discourse in and around racism. White people don't care about black people because they have more money than us. So we need to have some sort of way to deal with those kind of problems. And how we deal with them, I don't necessarily think it should be a USAF problem. It should be how we transform our particular societies to ensure that our societies become or institutions become a real reflection of our societies. So we need to nationalize. I don't know if we should nationalize. I don't know if we should throw a threat of pushing people to the sea. But it necessarily needs to happen so that we're seen as actual human beings in our country.
I'm going to ask you to also make your point perhaps on the microphone, because I saw you as well at some point. You were frantically nodding there as the panelists were having the conversation. I've got just a few more minutes before we get into ad break. What's your contribution?
Okay, mine is to speak particularly on transformative units within institutions of higher learning. It's always great when institutions of higher learning introduce transformative units, but they become problematic when, number one, the people who occupy seats within those transformative units are not willing to implement what is the purpose of that transformative unit. Because the central existence of a transformative unit is to what? To bring inclusivity, to ensure that we address issues such as racism, issues that are related to gender relations, and issues that are related to class struggles. But the minute you put in people within those positions of transformative units that do not care about issues of race because they do not affect them, that do not care about issues of gender or issues of class because they are not directly affected in any way by those particular issues, it's problematic, and it renders those transformative units basically useless.
Fruitless, indeed.
That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And of course, Ndumusha, inkulumo yethu iyaqhubeka just when we come back from the break. What do you have to say? The big question on the show namhlanje siyabuza, will we win the fight against racism ikakhulukazi in our tertiary institutions? Expressions is back after this. Stay with us.
Residence culture on Stellenbosch needs to change.
Do you see this poster? I don't want to stand here next year holding the same poster. Every single one of our citizens deserves basic human rights.
We'll never win with the same people in power. We've been fighting. We've been putting our best foot forward, but it's very difficult to make a change when the oppressed are the ones trying to make a change.
We're not winning the race. This has been fought for years.
I don't think that the university takes any of our issues very seriously, and I think that was made very clear when we were protesting and they remained inside and they watched us. Many of the students videoed us and were laughing at us, and it was like they were just observing. They didn't want to actually participate, and the issue didn't mean anything to them.
We have to speak to our friends of color to understand and to be able to sympathize with what they are going through and what they are experiencing on this campus on a daily basis.
A lot of rewriting of the university needs to happen, a lot of rewriting of policies.
We're going to continue doing this until something can be done. No tolerance, no tolerance. If you act a specific way, we are Keisha.
I want people to start unlearning the tendencies that their parents taught.
So those were some of the voices of young people who clearly feel very dissatisfied about how racism on their campus is being addressed. And of course, we're going to wrap up this very important conversation that we're having around racism. And remember, our poll question for today is, are we winning the battle of racism at our tertiary institution? Make sure you engage with us on our social media platforms. Jamie, and what is the way forward? Where to from here?
I think the way forward for this particular situation is we need to see community groups such as AfriForum. We need to see Prof. Madonsela. We need to see the Chancellor of the University, Mr. Rupert, stepping onto the ground, showing solidarity and providing leadership to those students who are holding back from joining this necessary conversation because you can't reconcile with yourself.
And for yourself, Hlonipho, what is the way forward? How do we address this?
I will reiterate again that what we need is the government to make a binding policy to all institutions, because institutions will continue to try and protect their names. These matters will happen and they'll be kept under the carpet because the institutions are protecting their names. So the government must implement a policy that will bind all institutions of higher learning to fight this GBV and racism.
Hlonipho and Jamie Mighty, thank you so very much for being part of this conversation. Well, I think you can also join me, and also a big thank you to the studio audience. I think there's no easy answer to this, but hopefully as Expressions, we were able to put a very important spotlight on maybe just, I think, the movement around young people and being wanting to be the change that they want to see.
Yeah, and as uhlelo, we only started it. From here, change must happen indeed. See, Expressions, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for participating in Nkundla Zethu Zokuxhumana. Till next time, sale kahle.
Adios, muchachos. Thank you for watching.